So dear friends, as I mentioned in the beginning of the Holy Eucharist, that this Sunday our gospel has something to do with the gospel last Sunday. So again, it is a continuation, and both of them are related closely. That's why in the gospel last Sunday and today's gospel actually cannot be separated, but the story is totally different, so that's why the parable also tells us different background. So I do believe many of you still remember what the gospel last Sunday was. And since we are a good Catholic, so do you still remember the gospel last Sunday? Meaning I'm the only one who still remember that. That's because I prepare my homily though. So the gospel last Sunday was about dishonest steward. Remember that? So now we remember. So he issued the promissory notes to the debtors in order to gain profits for himself before he got fired by the master. And he knew and started acting up to gain for himself. So the lesson of our gospel last Sunday is very clear because it was stated by Jesus himself. And for sure we don't have to make it up because the message is there in the gospel last Sunday. Make for yourself friends by means of wealth, so that when you fail, they may receive you into the eternal kingdom. And what does it mean for us? So this means caring for the poor and the needy and vulnerable. And this is very important for us because we have to see the context of the parable last Sunday in different perspective. It is not about money, by the way, but how we should put ourselves in that kind of situations when we are about to lose our job. So fortunately, this message is reinforced by its proximity in our gospel this week. And this is the reason why in the beginning of the Holy Eucharist I mentioned that the gospel today, today's gospel is related to the gospel last Sunday. Because these two different parables, but they are related. So since today's gospel is related to the gospel last Sunday, first of all, we need to understand the setting or the context of our today's gospel. And it is very clear that the context is the conversations of Jesus with the Pharisees and some scribes probably. Because at the time when Jesus had conversation with them, probably Jesus was pissed off by their argumentations or their perspective about wealth. And we can understand from this perspective. So Jesus knew the hypocrisy of the Pharisees. And he knew that the Pharisees were lovers of money. They love honorable places in the public. And Jesus also knew that the Pharisees always look down the poor. And this is the worst thing, by the way. Because they gain profit for themselves. They enrich themselves from the people asking for money, and also they love honorable places when they were invited in different places. And again, this is the worst thing from the perspective of the Pharisees. The worst thing is that they believe the wealth is a sign of God's blessings, and poverty is a sign of God's displeasure. Meaning to say, if you are rich, you have money, you have a wealthy property, you have a wonderful family, you have a good health, meaning to say that you are blessed by God. But if you are poor, you have nothing, you have nothing to offer, and you are poor, not only spiritually but also materially, that means you are cursed by God. So this mentality is very strong in order to see in the parable of today's gospel. And Jesus gave them a parable about Lazarus and a rich man because he wants to challenge them. He wants to challenge their perspective, looking down the poor. Then also they look down other people who are not in their line. So now, as we look at the parable today, we notice that in the gospel, Jesus does not mention the name of the rich man. He did not mention the name of the rich man. Instead, we do not know that his name, for sure, is undisclosed by Jesus because it was only a parable. But Jesus mentioned the name of Lazarus. Now, just information for you. This is the only person who is named in any Jesus' parable. If you see in the parable of Jesus, you will never see in any names, unless other than Lazarus. For instance, we have a parable about the prodigal sons. There is no name over there. Then we have lost coins, the parable about lost coins. There is no name over there. But here, we can see Lazarus, the name of Lazarus. Why Jesus mentioned the name of Lazarus? Because Lazarus' name actually is a variant of Eliezer in the Old Testament, which means God heals, God helps. Helps who? Helps his people, regardless who they are. So Jesus also challenged them to give understanding, to have understanding about what they have learned in the Old Testament, since the Pharisees and the scribes, they know perfectly about the Torah. And then Eliezer is in Torah also. That's why in the name of Lazarus, give them a warning, give them a sign that God helps, God heals. So since Jesus mentioned the name of Lazarus, this indicates how serious his concern to the Pharisees. And probably the name of Lazarus also is a true story based on the experience rather than a parable. Now, Jesus put two different contexts here about the situation where the Pharisees need to know the situations. So in order to make this parable visible to the Pharisees, Jesus established the extent of the rich man's wealth and the outstanding quality of his lifestyle. As we heard in the gospel today, Jesus said he was clothed in purple and fine linen. So in the Jewish traditions, by the way, for sure at the time when Jesus was alive, purple symbolizes wealth and power. He also wears fine linen. That's another sign of wealth for a rich man. And then Jesus also add another story in that almost every day eats with luxurious things. So for this, for sure, contradicts with the condition or situation of Lazarus, who was laid in the front of the rich man's gate with a full of sores. The gate serves both as a sign of the rich man's wealth and also as a barrier to unwanted visitors. So there is a distance over there. The gate also symbolizes the distance that separates Lazarus from the rich man's world. Lazarus not only has a gate, by the way, but the rich man has a gate. He does not even have a house, Lazarus. So this is the distance to make them understand the situation is. So lying just outside the rich man's gate means that he is physically separated from the rich man's house by only a few yards. So Lazarus' condition is exactly opposite with the rich man. He is sick, covered with sores. He is hungry, longing for the scraps from the rich man's table. And at banquets, the rich man wipes grease from his hands into a piece of bread and then throws the bread on the floor. The rich man is surely aware of Lazarus lying in his gate, but he does nothing to help. So he may consider himself charitable not to have removed Lazarus from the property. But at this point, we are also reminded with another parable, the situation of the prodigal sons when he lost and squandered the money of his father and begged, asking for help for his father. But the father accepted him. And for sure, this kind of story, the parable, is completely different. Now, I just want to invite you for these reflections. For our reflections, if we were Lazarus at the time, how must we feel to be so poor while seeing such wealth? So today, prosperity and poverty often coexist together in close proximity, sometimes fueling great anger on the part of the people who have neither money nor hope. Just like in the gospel today, we are not surprised to learn Lazarus' death. Poor people like Lazarus who are sick, who have no access to medical care, die early. But we may be surprised to learn of the rich man's death, because his resources provided him access to the good food, housing, and health care. In the end, all die together for nothing. So in the parable, Jesus said that both of them are dead. We do not hear in the gospel that the death of Lazarus was made of burial, but we do hear that the rich man received proper burial. In the ancient Jewish culture, people consider a proper burial to be a very important person, while not to receive a proper burial would be the final indignity for the life filled with indignity, meaning to say that person is nothing. So although we may assume that in this parable Lazarus did not receive the proper burial, but Jesus clearly tells us that Lazarus was carried away by the angels to the Abraham's bosom. This is the great turning point of the parable for the Pharisees, and perhaps also for all of us to open our eyes that prosperity and wealth are not guarantee for eternal life unless we utilize it for the glory of God. So dear friends, the bottom line is that the Pharisees can hardly miss that the parable is aimed at them. They regard their prosperity as God's reward for their good conduct. Instead, the parable give them a warning that if they are like the rich man in this life, they will be like him in death. It portrays a great reversal that challenges their conception that wealth or prosperity is a sign of God's favor and poverty a sign of God's displeasure. It is very understandable that what Jesus told us to the parable give them understanding about the concept of life. However, the Pharisees and the scribes at the time, they did not accept it. So the parable in today's gospel seems to be about money, wealth, and also prosperity, but actually it is really about values. It is not about material things. It is possible to be wealthy, to enjoy God's favor. It is nothing wrong that we are rich. We have a lot of example in the Old Testament. Abraham, for instance, David, King Solomon also, those are wealthy people. But the question is not whether we have money or we are wealth, but whether we love money or whether we share God's concern for the poor and vulnerable. In other words, whether we are too preoccupied with the personal concerns or to notice the needy like Lazarus in our midst. Finally, dear friends, the parable makes 2 points, by the way. The first one is, it has to do with the reversal for fortunes of this life in hereafter. And the second thing is that even the return of the messenger like Moses from the dead will not bring any changes for the rich who are so selfish and money oriented. So today we learn from the gospel today what we can bring for ourselves, especially for the growth of spiritual life.